So we will move now to the next session. So we will put two more, another author, like Patricia Sauthoff. Where is Patricia? So Patricia is an assistant professor in the Department of History at Hong Kong Baptist University. She was previously an assistant lecturer in history, classics, and religion at the University of Alberta, and a postdoctoral fellow on the European Research Council-funded Ayu Yog project, and a teaching fellow at the Nalanda University in Rajgir, Bihar. So her research explores death, medicine, health, anti-aging, sexuality, gender, and ritual in Sanskrit religious and religious medical texts, with an emphasis on Tantra and alchemy, Rasa Shastra. And she also has more than a decade of experience as a print and digital journalist, with a particular focus on arts, politics, and the media industry. So Patricia is the author of Tantric Dimensions of Alchemy in the Oxford Handbook of Tantric Studies. And of course, she's the author of Illness and Immortality, Mantra, Mandala, and Meditation in the Netra Tantra, which is the book we are going to discuss here today with David Gordon White, who is, I mean, I think it doesn't need an introduction, but he's a distinguished emeritus professor of religious studies at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and associate research fellow at the Center of the Sud-Asiatique et Himalayan, Paris. He's the author of Myths of the Dogman. We have mentioned also, he's the author of The Chemical Body, Kiss of the Yogini, Sinister Yogis, and Demons Are Forever, and all published by the University of Chicago Press. And he's also the author of the Yoga Sutra of Patanjali, a biography, published in 2014, and editor of Tantra in Practice and Yoga in Practice, all published by Princeton University Press. He was the recipient of a John Simon Guggenheim Fellowship in 2007, and has been the recipient of 3 Fulbright Fellowships for research in South Asia in 1984, 1993, and 1999. So it's a great pleasure to have both of you here, and the floor is yours.
Hello, Patricia. Nice to meet you. We've corresponded before, but never met in person or anything close to that. I think Patricia is the rising scholar who has the most in common with my own work, in the sense that we are both interested in the same topics, and also her approach is similar to mine. With respect to your book, I very much enjoyed reading this for the first time as an outside reader for the Oxford University Press, and again in preparation for this meeting. I especially appreciate Patricia's eschewing of the sola scriptura approach of the bulk of scholarship on Tantra in favor of her incorporation of material from other data sources. Rather than limiting herself to the world of the text, she also opens her discussion to the text and the world, with particular attention to its human actors, its real world practitioners, specifically the king and his mantrin in medieval South Asia. As such, hers is a socio-political analysis of the Netra Tantra, in addition to the iconographic, epigraphical, archaeological, and ethnographic sources. Patricia also engages with both non-tantric Hindu scripture, secular literature, and tantric Buddhist scripture. The book's 10 chapters are well organized, comprising a balanced series of cameo studies of selected portions of the Netra, chosen to ground her lucid discussions of the central themes and goals of tantric practice: language, myth, ritual, symbol, identity, initiation, protection, dream interpretation, salvation, and visualization. Often she pivots off her textual selections to engage with their real-world correlates: medieval Kashmiri worship images of Bhairava, the history of South Asian death-conquering practice, mandala construction, caste relations, patronage, and the social identities of tantric actors, and so forth. Patricia's detailed discussions and analyses of selected passages, particularly those concerning mantric formation and decoding, are superb. While much of the book's content is purely descriptive, translation, and analysis, I see this as a good thing, since it serves a pedagogical purpose. explaining through example. Furthermore, the book's descriptive passages are generally balanced by contextualizing discussion, which brings the material to life. Many of Patricia's theoretical insights are compelling, and her challenges to the work of other scholars are generally on target. This is one of a very short list of books on Hindu Tantra that works to provide an overview of the subject accessible to non-specialists. Alexis Sanderson's many near book-length studies of Hindu Tantra remain the gold standard, but the great man has never found a way to put his encyclopedic knowledge into a non-specialist, user-friendly monograph. André Padoud's 2010 French language Comprendre le tantrisme, les sources hindoues was an excellent introduction. Unfortunately, his 2017 English language adaptation, The Hindu Tantric World, an Overview, is an inferior study. And as I noted on the first page of my Kiss of the Yogini, I'm still very fond of Michel Strickmann's 1996 Mantra et Mandala, Le Bouddhisme tantrique en Chine, as a general introduction. However, that book too remains untranslated from the French. Patricia's book falls somewhere between a broad introduction, few of which had been successful to this point, and a specialized technical study of a text. And this, I believe, is the sweet spot at which writing on Tantra is best suited to reach as broad an audience as possible. In a world in which the general public is bombarded by fake expertise on internet and social networks, this is important. We as scholars owe it to our discipline to make true scholarship accessible and relevant, and Patricia's book does just that. Now I'm going to segue gradually into the questions that I want to discuss with Patricia. Concerning the Netra Tantra as a text, we've all been eagerly awaiting Gavin Flood's and Bjarneke Oleson's critical edition and translation of the entire work. In the meantime, translations of select chapters are already in circulation. Gavin's edition and translation of chapter 7 is accessible on the shaktatraditions.org website. Bettina Baumer's translation of chapters 1, 7, and 8, about which more shortly, has appeared in the form of a book titled The Yoga of the Netra Tantra, Third Eye and Overcoming Death, 2023. Sanderson has translated the latter portion of chapter 19, which Patricia has also translated in her book, and I've translated the former portion of the same chapter, some of which appears in my Diamonds Are Forever. More recently, I translated chapter 20 for the forthcoming Oxford Handbook of Tantric Studies, a chapter I want to bring into our discussion since it identifies itself as a treatise on the three yogas, or the threefold yoga. So, since top yoga is the topic of our meeting this weekend, that's what I want to turn to now and ask you, Patricia, how you approach the topic of yoga in your book. I couldn't help but notice that some of your discussion, which appeared in the manuscript draft that I read several years ago, disappeared from the print edition. So let's focus on that. Your particular focus on yogic practice is in the Netra Tantra is on what you call Stula Yoga. So I'd like to hear what you have to say about that, and more specifically, why you identify the contents. Oh, who's that?
That's PB.
Of the Netra's chapters, maybe one of Bhairava's minions. Why you identify the contents of the Netra's chapters 6 through 8 as focusing on yoga. So the floor is yours.
Well, it was really interesting. When I started working on this text, there wasn't much about it, right? You had Brunner's French language article from the 1970s. You had Sanderson, of course, from 2004. And then as I was working on it, all of these things started popping up that I realized people were working on. Your work, Bettina Baumer's work, Padoud's translation. And so all of that kind of shifted how I was thinking about the text. I was originally looking at those 3 chapters on yoga, 6, 7, and 8. And when I realized that 7 and 8 were already going to be so well covered, I thought to myself, well, I'm a social historian anyway. I'm not a yoga practitioner. I'm not that interested in, the yoga world. As modern yoga is not really my thing. And I thought, let's look at what they're actually doing, right? The seventh chapter is very philosophical. The eighth chapter on para yoga is very philosophical. But this sixth chapter just really focuses on, sacrifice, oblation, mantra recitation, and meditation. And I thought those were the ones where I could, like you said, get at the people the most, right? Rather than talk about all of this philosophy that's for this very small group of practitioners. What are people hiring these mantrans for? What are people asking these yogis to do? And so I was really focused on that. And, as I've talked to yoga teachers, a lot of them have said, I'm really starting to get more into meditation than the postures. And I thought, great, because that's what this book is very much about, is these meditations and these practice. I mean, there's no physical, postural yoga in this work at all. But this idea of, the sacrifice, and especially that mantric recitation and that meditation being so key, it really just struck me as a way to really humanize the practice rather than get involved in these deeply philosophical discussions, which are great, but which are elsewhere. I also really wanted to look at chapter 20. I was about to start translating it when your work came out, and I thought, well, okay, I guess I'll look at something else. So it was this kind of this weird thing that at the time I was working on it, there was so much interest in this text that I wanted to really make sure that what I focused on was slightly different than what other people were working on. And Renata Sonentiem at SOAS always said to me, look for the women, find the women. And there's not a lot of women in this book, but I looked for the people rather than the deities, right? That just sort of resonates in the back of my head still. Look for the women, look for the people, look for the real people who are doing things. Because I think when we look at these tantric texts, we often, look at them as edited editions and these very deeply philosophical works, and we forget that there were very real practitioners doing these things, and in this case doing them for a king who's not going to do these things on his own, right? But there's also this idea that the practice is continual, right? This mantran is doing this day and night, day in and day out for the king, and so you have this continual practice that keeps the world functioning. And I just found that to be really a fascinating idea of yoga, of this constant practice.
Okay, thank you. And yes, certainly that's one of the great strengths of your book, is that you're engaging with the practitioner and his clients in the world. But I really want to challenge you about your use of the term yoga in those three chapters. I know it's what Bettina Bäumer says in her book. She calls chapter 6 corporeal yoga. In chapter 7, she calls it subtle yoga. Chapter 8, she calls it supreme yoga. Rastogi makes similar claim. However, thanks to Mark Ditchkowski, who has been digitalizing the contents of so many tantric sources online. You can do word searches more quickly than just pouring through the PDFs of the original Kashmir Study series. I do a word search of the word yoga in chapters 6 through 8, and it almost never shows up. Sukshma Yoga Ta, chapter 7, verse 9. Ashtanga Yoga, chapter 8, verse 9, and Ashtanga Yoga, chapter 8, verse 21. However, when Kshemaraja introduces and concludes each chapter, the 3 chapters you're speaking of, he doesn't use the word yoga, he uses the word dhyana. Now, it's true what you say, or it's true what was said in the last meeting, that so much of the Yoga Sutra is about dhyana, what we call it, it's about meditation as opposed to postural yoga. But it's more than a quibble, especially in the light of chapter 20 of the Netra Tantra, to argue against your assertion that those 3 chapters are about yoga. I can read what Kshemaraja says. in his intro and his conclusion to those chapters. In his commentary on Netra Tantra 6's final verse, he writes, with this chapter, subtle meditation has been declared. And then chapter 7:1 reads, now I will tell you about the excellent supreme dhyana, and then it enters into a discussion of visualization of the 6 chakras, the 3 objects, the 5 voids, and so on. And this compound sukshma dhyana is found throughout chapter 7. Kshemaraja introduces chapter 8 with, related to subtle meditation, sukshma dhyana, the god spoke in consideration of supreme meditation, para dhyana. So I want you to tell me why you call that yoga, because the text doesn't call that yoga.
No, that's a really good point. And I talked to Gavin Flood about this a little bit. I think that whoever the author of the Netra Tantra is using yoga and dhyana kind of as synonyms for one another. I don't think Kshemaraja is. I think Kshemaraja does that much less so, and yeah, it doesn't talk about yoga, it talks about meditation. By the time he's writing, I think there's more of a distinction. Also, I call it yoga because this text is so connected to the Svachanda Tantra, and the Svachanda Tantra does use the word yoga quite a bit, and actually calls, instead of a mantra vid, you have a yoga vid. And so in these sections where there's connections between the two, and especially chapter 6 of the Netra Tantra and chapter 7 of the Svachanda Tantra, you have a lot of shared ideas. There's obviously an influence of the Svachanda Tantra on the Netra Tantra. And so because I think they're kind of using these terms synonymously, I chose to stick with the word yoga because I think it's more accessible than dhyana or even meditation, because it's not just meditation, it is action. Right? There are practices involved. So I think it is more than just meditation, but I think it's a good point that the book doesn't call it yoga, very firmly itself. It throws the word in every now and again. But yeah, like I think dhyana is not quite the right word in our context because it's so focused just on meditation. And this is talking about, the chakras, the movement up and down of the breath, and that connection with the deity, that, yoking to the deity. I think that makes it more, I think yoga is a more appropriate term than dhyana because of that ultimate goal. And of course, the commentary is non-dual, and the original text is dualistic. That idea that the end goal is non-death and connection with the divine, whether it be immersion in or just connection with, is still, much more beyond just meditation. It is more of a sort of yoking, a connection, a coalescing. So I suppose that's why I chose the word rather than dhyana.
Well, good enough, well enough. However, if one takes the Netra Tantra at its word, chapter 20 is the chapter on yoga because it's introduced that way, and its content is the 3 yogas, or the threefold yoga. And that yoga has nothing to do with what we've been discussing, which is more sort of our received notion of yoga, because we know what the Yoga Sutras are and we know what Hatha Yoga is and so forth. So in a way, there's some kind of anachronism in the position that chapters 6 through 8 are about yoga. They're about yoga as we understand it more today, but the Netra Tantra, if we take it at its word, understood yoga in a very different way.
Absolutely.
In as much as chapter 20 it introduces itself by talking about the threefold yoga. It uses the term yoga declined or in compounds 18 times in the text itself and countless times in Kshemaraja's commentary. And the chapter is just full of yuj verbs and nouns. So yoga, yogi, yogini, yojanam, prayojanam, niyukta, viyukta, upayukta, yajayanti. And Shimaraj's introduction says para sukshmadi yogena, by means of the yoga of para sukshma, etc. The etc. being stula, which is what you discuss at greatest length in your book. But in fact, there's like 40 verses in chapter 20 on stula yoga, and it really does unpack it in a much more direct way than does chapter 6. So it's worth noting that. And I mean, with your, well, why don't you respond to me? And then, I mean, I would like to expand on that because the content of chapter 20 is so interesting. And so it's actually a very well-structured chapter, whoever the author of it was.
It is. It's much more well structured than a lot of the rest of the text, which I think, is interesting from a philological standpoint. I mean, I'm not one of these critical edition people, but I imagine that one of the first things that one of those folks would say is this original? I don't have an answer for that, but yes, it is very different. And part of the reason I guess I didn't focus on that chapter so much, which of course there are lots of women there, right? There's all these yoginis, I mean, but they're not the real women.
Absolutely.
So I think it's more because it was more of that philosophical rather than practical aspect is part of why I sort of steered away from it. Because I didn't want to get too in the weeds of the philosophy, although, with the discussion of mantra, we went way into the weeds on that one. But yeah, I think it's a good point to bring up that, that this idea of yoga in the 9th century and even the 11th century is so different from what we're talking about with yoga now. And again, in this Vachanda Tantra, I assume it's a he who wrote it, talks about constant yoga and meditation and talks about these two things in tandem. So again, I did work a lot with this Vachanda Tantra in contrast to this text because it's clear that it's connected to it. So perhaps I let that sort of trickle into my looking at the Netra Tantra maybe a little too much. I still think yoga is a good term for it, but I do think it's vastly different from the kind of yoga that we think of today. It's much more like practice. But again, practice is kind of problematic because we think about practice, we think about bending, right? And we're not talking about bending. We're talking about oblation. We're talking about rituals. We're talking about taking medicines and saying mantras to protect those and then giving them to a patient. And I've never really read anything quite like this text, which is also part of what was so intriguing to me about it, is that it's super weird. It's so odd. Even within all the odd things of Tantra, it's weird. And in some ways much more practical. But that image of Samputa encasing a pill with the mantra to make it effective that's really the thing that like got me hooked on this text, was this idea that there's a real practical and yet very philosophical, very supernatural element to all of this. And so if you're going to be healthy, it's not just about taking medicines. It's about, in this case, hiring someone to like convince God not to kill you too early or to get rid of your illness or to give you wealth or beauty, right? There's all of those things as well. It's not just, illness is also just sort of like aging, decay. And I think, in the modern term, we also think of yoga in those kind of wellness concepts, right? Oh, you do yoga, you look younger, your body's different, it's healthier. So I think that modern influence also sort of crept into my work of just how we think about yoga and healing. Rather than like, meditation is not, people don't really like, oh, I'm going to meditate in order to not get gray hair. Although there's that in Tantra as well. Meditating on black lotuses and all kinds of weird things that Shaman Hatley writes about. But yeah, I mean, it is a very different conception of yoga. It's also a different conception of who's doing it, right? I'm not gonna go down the street and pay a yoga practitioner to do yoga on my behalf, right? So that I'm healthier. This is something I have to do. Whereas in this text, you do it for somebody else. And I'm not really aware of any so direct comment about that in these other tantras of like hiring somebody. I wish they told us how much they got paid, but they do tell us a little bit about, like, he lives in, you know, in the castle. He's got this like corner of the castle. You do kind of get this information that this guy really is hanging around the complex, the court complex. And that's I think what to me was the most interesting, is that there is this person whose job is just to like spiritually keep the world chugging along.
Yeah, for sure. Danny, Lucy, are we moving into the final phase of our 40-minute,
But it was
4
very,
minutes of
very,
training?
yeah, it was very great to listening at this interaction. So, but yes, we have a question, right, Vicky?
From Ruth, I think.
Yeah. Ruth, would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. That was a really fascinating discussion. I'm sorry that I haven't read your book, Patricia, and I need to get on it. I found it really interesting what you were talking about, looking for the actual real people. So, and just in your last answer, you were starting to go in the direction a little bit more. So maybe could I invite you to give us more kind of anecdotes of the people that you did find in the sources, and perhaps in comparison to the yoginis of, say, chapter 20, how you find them different, and what the real people tell us about the context of textual production. Thank you for this work.
Yeah, so, you know, in chapter 20, we have all of this stuff about exorcism and getting, you know, these yoginis who are attacking the body and how to appease them. But it's the body is sort of a, you know, a byproduct of the text, right? There's yoginis, they're attacking a body. And in some other parts, you get mentions of, you know, this cures coughing, fever. So you start to get these very real ailments that come in that gives this idea of more of a focus on individuals. And there are some mentions that this is, you know, this person is employ of the king. There's not a ton. I mean, it's not a very easy text to just read in social context, which is part of why in the book I really try to connect it to some of the other things that are going on, right? Is this Puranic? How is this different? And what does that tell us about these people in Kashmir? Who are they meditating on? There's this great section on the iconography that ends, you know, it starts with Amartya, the god of non-death. It goes down through all these different iterations, and it ends with the Buddha. And then it makes this great comment about how basically like, oh, well, the Buddha is for women. And I thought, well, what does that mean? And so I started looking, and it turns out that the women of the court were the ones who were paying for Buddhist temples, whereas the men were paying for Hindu temples, right? So it's kind of a slight to Buddhism, but if you look into it as like, who are these actual people? It's not just like Buddhism's for girls. It's like, no, the women were doing Buddhist practices and the men were doing Hindu practices. And that's really interesting, right? And that tells us a lot about the world at the time, that you do have these interactions. And so that caused me to look into some of the Buddhist texts and the Buddhist rites of, you know, conquering death, and seeing that there's a lot of similarities there. And so, you know, for textual production, I think this is going on at a time when Buddhism and Hinduism aren't different religions, really. They're kind of more different sects within this very vibrant world where you have people worshiping different deities on different days of the week, different calendrical events. And everybody can kind of worship everybody, because depending on whatever text you're looking at, your God is the ultimate, right? You can worship Buddha as a form of Amartya. He's still Amartya. We just think of him as Buddha because it's Buddha's day, or because you're a woman, right? And so it was like those little clues that I really tried to chase down to find out, well, what's going on in this world? And then, you know, Gudrun Bunneman has done some amazing work looking at some of the actual physical iconography in the world, right? And showing that this text didn't just exist as a text. Somehow people were taking, maybe not straight from this text, most likely, you know, the artists weren't reading the Netra Tantra and the chiseling, but the descriptions of the gods in the Netra Tantra end up in the world, right? So we can see that they had an impact. And the most important one is in Kathmandu. where there's this royal bath where the kings would go in and bathe, right? And when you look at the text, it's like bathing is very important. It's the first part of the ritual. So again, we can see that like this isn't just theoretical. It's not, and we can never look at these books and say, oh, this is exactly what they were doing. But we can kind of trace like, no, they really were doing some of these things. They really did have an impact on the world that still exists, which I think is very cool because we get so wrapped up in the like, what is the difference between, you know, connection and non-connection and all of these philosophical things that are so fun to think about. But at the end of the day, when you're chanting mantras, you know, you're doing something and it's supposed to have a real impact on the world. And so to see that these practices continued all the way from Kashmir into Nepal, they did have an impact on the world rather than just being theoretical. And the Nepalese manuscripts, which I haven't had the chance to look at very much, but I know that they're slightly different than the Kashmiri retention, which is what I used.
Yeah.
So there are some differences, right? So we can also see that there's some change that goes on. And part of the reason, well, I chose to look at the Kashmiri version for two reasons. One, 3 years of a PhD at SOAS doesn't give you a lot of time to look at manuscripts. And also, you know, these are texts that were published in the 1920s and 30s, right? And people were still reading them. You can still get sort of reprinted copies of them. They're online. There's tons of mentions of this text, right? So it's not a direct lineage, you know, it's not the practices they were doing then, they're doing now. But there is still sort of a connection to this as a text that people find important. And so I wanted to look at that, the version that people were using today to disseminate the text.
Great. Patricia, I mean, actually, I have a lot of questions, so perhaps I will ask you like later on. Because I was really, I mean, what you did, like looking at people practicing and what they were doing is like, okay, I was looking for this kind of book actually to read. So it was very great. And I mean, we don't have I mean, I was wondering if it's a kind of a, you know, the author of this text is a mantring trying to sell himself to the king, therefore, and is in the book present, because if there is a mantring that, as you said, is living together with the king or in the presence of the kingdom, but what about other kings? I mean, they will have their own mantrins, right? And so is the mantrins explaining how to protect the king from the other mantrins? Because I mean, this kind of conflict among mantrins, who's gonna win?
Yeah.
There is a little bit of that. Yeah, there is, you know, how to counteract spells from a bad person, right? There is mentions of sort of negative, and I think David's probably written about this more and thought about it more than I have, but there is definitely mentions of like how to counteract negative rituals. There's not a discussion of like, this is how you beat that other guy. But there are things, you know, like, well, if you protect all of your cows and you protect all of your people, then your kingdom will be good, right? You've got to go out and put the vermilion on the ear, on the not the ears, the horns of the cows, right? And so there is an acknowledgement that there are other people like this out there. And so, yeah, I guess you just have to say that, like, well, I've read this text, so I'm the best one. It's not quite, I always think of the Lotus Sutra as like the most self-advertising text I've ever read, because it just tells you all the time, if you read the Lotus Sutra, then you will be, you know, you will be liberated. Continue to read the Lotus Sutra. And you're like, I am reading the Lotus Sutra. Like, tell me what to do. And it's like, just keep reading, just keep reading. And though it's not like that, it's not just, but it does say things. I've got a great quote here from it that says, the Netra Tantra goes beyond death conquest to include lifespan, strength, victory, loveliness, firmness, wisdom, a beautiful form, and good fortune. The highest kingdom for kings, all of these will arise, right? So it is kind of telling you, like, this book is the one. You get everything. You'll live longer. You'll be healthy. If you're tormented by pain, that'll go away. If you're sick, a barren woman will obtain a son. A girl will attract a husband. The beneficiary will surely attain whatever pleasures he wants, right? So it is saying, you know, if you use this book or you hire the person who can use this book, you get it all, right? The whole world is your oyster.
Well, that's something that Helen Brunner drew our attention to 50 years ago, is that the Swachanda Tantra is about the permanent and occasional rites. The Netra is about kamya. It's about the voluntary ones that you do for yourself or for your clients. So I think that's one of the reasons why it's so this worldly, is that it's about those rituals, those specific rituals, the ones that really get you the good stuff in the world. Yeah.
Yeah, and obviously, I mean, now that I've moved on to looking more at alchemy, like I am interested in that. What do you do to get a good life? What do you do to get health? It was sort of a natural progression for me to move from the Netra Tantra, which is about all these rituals to do this, to then look at, well, then what ingredients are in that pill, right? That pill that's surrounded by the mantra, what's in the pill? And so it was a real natural progression to me to try to find out what's in that pill.
Yeah, but so I mean, I think in the book you stress the different ideas of immortality, right? Even just to have a long life could be discussed or considered as a kind of immortality. Did I understood well?
Yeah, there's a section, it's not in the Netra Tantra, but it's in a book, I can't remember the name of it right now, from around the same time, that says basically to attain immortality is to live life, basically to live life as long as you're supposed to, right? So you don't die prematurely or to 100 years. And either of those can be sort of considered immortality. So it's not, yes, there are these ideas of, yogis who are living up in the hills who've been there for 1,000 years. But these aren't the Chinese kings that are trying to, eat mercury to live forever. These kings are just trying to live the full, that's what it is, the full extent of one's life. Right. So it's like there's this predetermined amount of time that you're supposed to live, and you have to stave off dying before that. And so that's what this conquering death is about. It's not really about living forever. It's about being youthful and living, for as long as possible, and dying when one is supposed to die. I wish it got more into the sort of karma and the more sort of nitty gritty of that. But unfortunately, I think that's probably something people had a lot of conversations about with each other that didn't quite make it into the texts.
Yeah, but I mean, this could be very useful because a lot of Hatha Yoga textual sources talk about immortality. And if this idea is put in this context, and especially the idea that these textual sources were for kings, let's say patronage and so on, it makes much more sense if we are talking about real people, reading or maybe practicing this. And it was like, oh my God, it's great. Thank you, Patricia. Really.
And there's, thinking about the idea of living forever is, no matter how good of a yogi you are, it's got to get boring, right? There's no discussion in these texts of the practicalities of like, what do you do when you live forever? And that's something that has really struck me for a very long time. Simone de Beauvoir wrote a book called All Men Are Mortal, and it talks about like this woman who falls in love with this immortal man. And there are these parts where he's just like, yeah, I've fallen in love a bunch of times. Like, I can't do it anymore. I've seen wars. Like, he's just so bored with the world. And it's just, that book has really stuck with me because it's like, yeah, it would be really boring to live forever.